If any of these clips are relatable to you, stick around for this video. It's probably going to be a massive help. Have you ever been playing a top tier match and no matter what you do, you just can't seem to flare certain missiles in a rear aspect launch, or even sometimes a side aspect launch? In these clips here, you see me cutting afterburner, absolutely dumping flares, doing everything I can to try to not eat these missiles, and they're still hitting me. What am I doing wrong? Well, we're going to talk about that in this very video, and hopefully it makes you a little bit more survivable in an ARB match. If you find this video helpful, make sure you subscribe so that you can see more, and let me know in the comments down below so that I know if I should continue making tutorial style videos like this. Ever since the introduction of the AIM9M and the R73 heat-seeking missiles, I have seen a lot of comments and in-game chats of people complaining that these missiles are unflareable, and while sometimes they are unflareable, there's definitely ways we can counter them. Certain missiles are modeled in certain ways. For example, the R73 and the Magic II have modeled flare resistance. You may know it as IRCCM, and the AIM9M also has its own flare resistance models, and they are completely different. They behave entirely differently. And to give ourselves a better chance at actually defeating these missiles, it is helpful to actually understand how they work. And so with that being said, I'm going to let my good buddy Jake explain how these missiles are modeled to you. And if you like this style of content, make sure you check out his channel, which will be linked in the description down below.
To understand how to flare IR missiles, it's beneficial to understand how they work in the game. IR signatures in War Thunder are split into different bands. Band 0 is the thermal signature of the engine when viewed from rear aspect. Band 1 is the signature of the airframe. This is what all aspect missiles can detect, which makes them all aspect. Band 2 is flares, and Band 7 is the afterburner plume. Sensitivity to each band is governed by range band values. To flare a basic IR missile, your objective is to make your flares the brightest thermal signature in the missile's field of view. This is easier to do with early missiles like the AIM-9B because they have high range band 2 to range band 0 ratios. That is, they tend to be highly sensitive to flares and not very sensitive to aircraft. On top of that, their field of view is often pretty wide, meaning they can see multiple flares at the same time. As you get into newer missiles like the AIM-9E and AIM-9D, the flare resistance goes up. This is because the sensitivity to planes increases while the sensitivity to flares decreases, in addition to the field of view becoming smaller. These medium flare resistance missiles are very common. Every rear aspect sidewinder except the 9B, the R13M1, the Magic 1, the PL5 all have the same flare resistance, for example. Moving up into all-aspect missiles like the AIM9L, Python 3, and R24T, the sensitivity value for Band 2 and the sensitivity value for Band 0 is the same. Missiles with 1-to-1 range band values like this can be particularly flare resistant, especially from rear aspect. IRCCM, or infrared countermeasures, is something you find on top-tier missiles which attempts to help missiles reject flares and hit their target. There are currently two types of IRCCM in War Thunder. The first type is Gatewidth. As I mentioned earlier, missiles with a smaller seeker field of view can be more difficult to flare. What Gatewidth does is it restricts the field of view on the missile at the moment of launch. The R73 is probably the most notable user of this type of IRCCM. On the rail, the R73 has a field of view of 4.5 degrees, but when you launch it, the field of view decreases all the way down to 0.75 degrees. With such a tight field of view, it becomes really difficult to actually get flares between the missile and your plane, especially as the missile gets closer to you. The other type of IRCCM is commonly referred to as tracking suspension. This is currently only found on the AIM-9M in ARB. Tracking suspension IRCCM causes the seeker to shut off when it detects a flare in its field of view, while the missile continues to follow your plane based on the last known trajectory. When the flare is gone, the missile reacquires lock and continues tracking.
That is some fantastic information. Now how do we apply it to War Thunder? Well, in these clips you're going to see me getting absolutely clapped by these Gatewidth IRCCM missiles, the Magic 2 and the R73, because they're getting launched from too close of a range. That's the big error here, and the main takeaway in this part of the video is you can't let these missiles get launched at you from sub 1.5 kilometers. 1.5 to 1 kilometer launches or anything closer, you're pretty much just dead. You need to have your head on a swivel, and you need to be able to take action before these missiles get to really close range. As Jake explained, after launching, the seeker head of these missiles' FOV shrinks down dramatically once it leaves the rail. And a little exercise to help you guys kind of understand this concept, I want you to make a tiny little peephole with your thumb and your forefinger, and I want you to pick up your mouse with the other hand, and I want you to put that little peephole right in front of the mouse. You probably can't see anything through that peephole except for a very tiny portion of the mouse, which is covering the entire field of view of your peephole. Well, now take your mouse and move it an arm's length away from your peephole. and now you can see the surrounding area around the mouse as well. And the seeker head is seeing the same thing. The closer it gets, the more it's no longer going to see that surrounding area, and therefore it's not going to see your flares when you're dropping them from the airplane. All it's going to see is the actual tiny portion of the airplane that it's locked onto. So distance is important, and how do we apply that distance? Well, again, it's about situational awareness. If you see somebody behind you, like this MiG-29G that I notice is slotting in behind me, I'm just going to assume he's probably going to try to shoot a missile at me. And so before he gets to that no escape 1.5 to 1 kilometer range, I'm going to begin turning in, changing aspect, and making sure I can actually get these flares off from side aspect and from further range, and that way I'm not in some kind of unflareable rear aspect scenario. Honorable mention here is head-ons. A lot of people like to full commit into head-ons even with top tier, and that's just not a good idea. If you're full committing to a head-on, they can do a last-second R-73 launch, park it right on your forehead, and there's just going to be no flaring. If it's way too close, it's not going to see your flares, and you're just going to die. You can see here, I'm committing to the head-on, he launches it last second. It doesn't even matter if I flare, I'm not going to be able to pull away. And so, just like with real guns and not missile combat, if you're going head-to-head against somebody's cannons, you're going to pull off at a reasonable distance. And it's the same thing. I'm going to go for the head-on here, but once I get kind of close, I'm just going to pull away. Because even if I don't flare the missile, I can at least just outpull it, and it's not going to be able to keep up from that closure rate. So thus far, the key takeaways is don't let any of these Gatewidth IRCCM missiles within 1.5 kilometers of your 6 o'clock. Make sure you're at least changing aspect by the time they get into that close range before the time of launch. And the aspect change is still very important, because while it's one battle to fight for the missile to actually be able to see your flares within that tiny field of view, it's another battle to that once it does see your flares, you have to make sure that it's going to prefer the flares over your plane. So you got to make sure that the plane is not as hot and not as tasty looking as your flares. So the aspect change, the reduction of throttle, cutting afterburner, all that stuff still applies to these Gatewidth IRCCM missiles. And real quick, you're going to see on the screen that I'm pre-flaring. This is another tactic especially helpful in dogfights. It doesn't always work depending on how close the fight is actually happening. If they get a launch off at close range, pre-flaring might not save you, but it is definitely something still worth trying. And so what a pre-flare is that if I'm anticipating a launch, I'm going to start flaring before the actual launch happens. He may launch it, he may not, but either way, having flares already down is going to disturb that seeker, and it might not lock onto you as it leaves the rail. It might be already locked onto a flare. And so all of this together honestly makes Gatewidth IRCCM much more effective and much more difficult to flare under the right launch conditions than something like an AIM9M, which we are going to touch on just after this. Because you're really fighting two battles here. Not only do you have to make sure that the missile's tiny field of view seeker head is actually going to see your flares, but once it does see your flares, you also have to make sure that they're going to be hotter than your plane. And with the new flare rise time, that can sometimes be very challenging. Something like an AIM9L can sometimes even be difficult to flare. And so a quick side note on the AIM9L and the Python 3, for example, I just recommend that you treat those missiles just like you would an R-73 or Magic 2. They're not going to be as effective, so if you treat them in the same manner, you will be a lot better off and a lot safer. They have a 1-to-1 ratio of preferring flares to planes, as Jake mentioned earlier in the video, and so if they get a close range shot just like an R-73 at sub 1.5 to 1 kilometer rear aspect, you're going to have a really hard time flaring it, because it's more often than not probably just going to prefer your plane, considering flares now have a rise time, as in they take time to actually heat up. And so for the majority of its flight, it's going to think your plane's hotter, and you'll probably just end up eating it. So take the same precautions against the Python and the 9L as you would these other Gatewidth missiles. Now let's move on to the AIM9M, and first off, specifically what not to do. The common mistakes I see with flaring the AIM9M is flaring in bursts. Why don't you want to flare in bursts? Well, it's because once the seeker turns off, when it detects flares, it's going to turn itself back on once it doesn't detect flares, and then just continue tracking you. Okay, well, what about this clip? I'm flaring constantly without any bursts here. Well, the problem is I'm not changing course while I'm flaring. The missile seeker is turned off that entire time because my flares are making it turn off, but it's continuing to guide itself based on my last known trajectory. Okay, so what's the correct way to flare an AIM9M? Well, you're going to see it on screen here. I'm going to be constantly dropping the flares to make sure that the seeker actually stays turned off, and then I'm going to make a drastic direction change so that it's not going to continue tracking my last known trajectory and end up actually being correct and hitting me. Same thing again, he launches another AIM9M. I'm going to constantly press my flare key to keep that seeker head shut off and so that it won't update my position, and then I'm going to make a drastic course change so that its last known trajectory is not correct anymore and it's not going to hit me. You can see it was going for my last known trajectory, but alas, since I changed my flight path, it ends up missing. So while this can be easier to flare sometimes, it is also important to note that this is going to consume a lot of your flares. And if you're somebody that only has 60 total countermeasures, running mixed is going to run out very quickly if you're flaring an AIM9M. Flaring in bursts let the seeker head turn on in between your flare burst and then update its last known trajectory, eventually hitting you. And not changing trajectory is going to let the missile hit you anyways, even if you keep the seeker turned off while spamming the flares. The correct form, if you will, is going to be to constantly spam your flare key and then make a drastic course change while you're doing that. And so I thought I'd throw this into the video as a last little honorable mention. We have AIM-9Gs being fired. This kind of falls into the rear aspect missiles that are not difficult to flare whatsoever, and you pretty much just cut your afterburner and change direction, and it will almost always go for your flares. Special thanks to Jake for helping out with this video. Again, his channel is linked in the description down below, and if you learned anything new, let us know in the comments down below.